All right, John, you're all set.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Scott. I'll be running the meeting today. We'll go ahead and call the meeting sort of to order at 9:05. I don't believe we have a quorum, so we'll just have a discussion meeting at this point, and until a quorum, if we get a quorum arrives, we won't be voting on anything today. I'd like to acknowledge the public that have come today, and thank you for your attendance. Let's see, the minutes we can't vote on, so we'll skip over that. I guess we'll go right into the actuarial update.
Before we do that,
Just skip.
yeah, we'll just take attendance.
Oh, we
Yes,
do need
I'll
to
take
take it down.
attendance. I'll take
Okay.
attendance. So Adrian Cochran will not be joining us today. Andrea Comer will not be joining us today. Ellen McKitterick,
Present.
John Scott,
Here.
Mike Soltis,
Here.
and Holly Williams will not be joining us, so we do not have a quorum.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess we'll just jump ahead to the actuarial quarterly update. Will the folks from Spring Group please go ahead and start your presentation?
Will do. If you could enable screen sharing, I'd like to pull up my presentation on the screen.
We should be all set.
So good morning, everyone. The purpose of this part of the presentation, my prepared remarks, is to talk about the updated quarterly results. So these are the results that in the second quarter of the fiscal year, from July 2023 to December 2023. I'll talk the presentation is in a similar format as what you've seen before. So we'll talk about the key results, and then go through some of the detail behind that, and then also talk about the updated projection for the full fiscal year. I'll start off with the actual results here in this middle column compared to the prior projection that we would have put in, you would have seen from November 2023. Our starting fund balance, and this is the fund balance as of June 30th, 2023, was $557.2 million. We had contributions earned of $206.3 million, a little bit higher than what we had in our prior projection for this 6-month period. Investment income was also higher. It's as a percent quite a bit higher than what we had before, again driven by higher better economic results. Incurred claims were slightly higher, but 0.5% higher than what we had before, so 180.7 compared to 179.8 million. So that's incurred claims, and other expenses were lower on the flip side by about $1 million. So overall, the results are positive relative to the prior projection, driven by primarily the investment income and also contributions, and then the other factor is lower expenses. So those three things helped with better results, and then offset slightly by the higher claims number. So 23.5 million net activity, that puts up fund balance net of outstanding contributions and claims payments. So these are the reserves that we typically hold, of 580.7 million. So that compares to the prior projection of 576.1. So about 0.8% higher than what we had before. The fund position continues to remain strong, and certainly within the funding metrics that we had laid out across the board. So that's also positive at that standpoint. I'll move on to the next page. We typically show this as an illustrative exhibit. It shows the same numbers that we had in the prior page, but just as an illustration. So just if you're looking at the actual total revenue, which is made up of contributions and investment income, was 220.6 million. Expenses were 197.1 million. So that takes us from 557.2 to 580.7 million. And you can see the corresponding result from the prior projection. This following page just provides the details. I'll come back to it if there are any questions, but for the purposes of this initial comments, we didn't have any detailed comments on this page, but it does provide the same results, just with more detail on this page. And if there are any questions, I'll come back to it. This next page provides the updated full year projection. So this is for the period July 2023 to June 2024. The beginning fund balance, again, 557.2 million. And then the full year projection is updated to be 75.4 million. So a little bit higher than 70.8 million that we had before in terms of net activity. And that's driven by the updated quarterly results. So as you saw, with slightly higher contributions, investment income was also a little bit higher. Those are factored into these numbers. Incurred claims were a little bit higher as well, not too large. So we've only updated that a little bit. And then the other expenses were a little bit lower, as you saw before. So that's also reflected here. Net activity, 75.4 million, which puts us at around 630 million as an ending fund balance. But those are the factors that contributed to the updated projection. So this 632.6 million compares to a prior projection of 628 million. In relatively close numbers, but we thought it would be prudent to continue to update this, and we'll continue to do so as we get quarterly results. Okay. That's the end of the prepared comments. I'll open it up for questions.
Are there any questions? I have some. Could you go back to the very first slide?
This one, yeah.
So, I feel like I'm beating a little bit of a dead horse because I keep, talking about this and seeing these numbers just grow bigger and bigger, and it makes me more and more uncomfortable. So you projected an original fund balance of being 576 million, and our actual appears to be about going on $5 million better than your projection. Do you see this, if you were to play the next quarter, do you see this continuing to be $4 to $5 million ahead of your projections? And I know that the next item on the agenda is to talk about a rate contribution rate change, but this seems to be the more appropriate time to talk about it in some respects because the numbers are on the table here.
Yeah, so the couple things happen. I mean, as you probably already figured, one, investment income was higher. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. I'm not necessarily sure if I can comment on the likely returns, investment returns, but to the extent that they continue to be higher than what we have here, that could result in more a higher number than what's shown. Contributions, I know that we've also had some specific activity around contributions, so that also is bringing in likely one of the factors that's contributing to higher contributions coming in. Mm-hmm. So again, specific reasons around those two numbers being likely being driven by being higher that may not necessarily continue into next quarter. Right now, at the end of the day, these numbers, in the bigger scheme of things, are relatively close, right? But we can point to specific reasons why these two numbers were higher in this first 6 months relative to our projection. And then on the other hand, claims also are trending higher, and that is maybe more of a concern, particularly in the long term. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it in the next I think the next agenda item, or one of the agenda items that's coming up. But that is I guess the risk, right? Like you see the claims continue to increase, and we I think in the last little bit hit another record month or record week where the claims payments were much higher. Those things are the concern and the risk, and to some extent, while we were looking at historical data to predict what the future claims will be, we're seeing some weeks where the claims are higher than what we projected, even with assumed increases in claims. So, some of this is more driven by specific items for the quarter. So not necessarily items that you can continue to expect to happen in the future. Yes. John, to
I think that helps. I guess a question I have for you, I don't know if a presentation like this is part of the next part of the conversation that we have on our agenda today, but if we added a what if column, like what if we had reduced the contribution a 1/4 point, or what if we had reduced it by 1 point, how would that affect the numbers that you're putting on here as far as your actuarial report? Is that something that maybe
That's-
we ought to look at going forward as we think about doing a rate change in the next year?
So John, you are absolutely anticipating the next agenda item.
Okay.
So if anyone has any questions about the current report, we could finish that part and then we can move on.
That's fair.
the next one.
I just have some more questions. I mean, we'll come back
Yeah.
to the agenda, and then these ratios. You know, we're coming in. Our actual metrics are pretty good. You know, like 1 to 1, 0.8 to 1. The target is less than 3.3 to 1. So, can you explain what that ratio 3 to 1 comes from, and if what that would mean to these finances if we were closer to the 3 to 1, and I guess what triggers us being closer to 3 to 1 than 1 to 1 or whatever it is here?
Yeah, so the first item on this is the reserve, and actually we have a description in the back, so maybe I'll jump to that just to make sure we're all looking at it in the same way. Easy to follow. So the first item is the reserve that's being held compared to the fund balance. Now the reserve is pretty small relative to the fund balance. You know, we're closer to 50 million compared to the 500 odd million that we have in the fund. But it is a indicator of the ability of the fund to pay for the claims that have already that have been estimated to have happened. It's an indicator that you know, the fund can cover those costs. So to the extent that the reserve goes up or the fund balance becomes very small, you know, we may not have enough money in the fund to pay those reserves, and that's the indicator there. Okay.
Can I just inject here? The definition of reserve here is very technical, and it is the expected cost of claims for events that have already been incurred, but the benefits have not been paid, right? So it's very much specific to kind of this point in time, as opposed to what we'll be talking about in the next agenda item, which is, you know, being able to make sure that we have sufficient funds in the balance as a whole to withstand, you know, bad events that they may happen.
Right. But where does that target come from? That 3 to 1 ratio there, or less than 3 to 1?
Yeah, so it was developed, I guess, a couple of years back based on looking at industry best practice in the kind of primarily the insurance industry. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, those metrics were developed based on looking at that. So it's intended to be, you know, if you're thinking about it from a full insurance perspective, you know, a benchmark, I guess, and a spot where we want to be. All of these metrics effectively coming from insurance, more broader insurance experience, let's say. Okay, but there are specific reasons why these were selected. So the reserve one we just talked about, contributions again. It's an assessment of the adequacy of the fund balance, like it says here, to cover inadequate contributions or lower contributions. So if you're not getting those contributions, we have enough money to pay the claims. And then the last one is a function of looking at it from the perspective of the claims side. So we talk about contributions, the reserve, and the third one is the claims side. If you do have larger losses in a year, can the fund handle that? So that's kind of the intent of that third metric, if you will. So in this case, what was selected was what we have here. So the target is that the financial activity in the next year with adverse losses is less than half of the net fund balance. So that's kind of how this is developed. In other words, the fund balance should at least cover 2 years of adverse losses. So, and adverse losses in this case was defined as a 50% increase in incidents, so claims basically increasing by 50%. as an adverse scenario, if you will. And again, we can model out different scenarios, and we've certainly done that for like the next discussion. But this is kind of the metric that was selected to keep it something to keep a target, have a as a target for this purpose. And similarly, I guess on the contribution side, the fund balance should cover at least 1/3 of next year's contributions. So that's like the 3-to-1 ratio that we've got. So going back to this, hopefully that helps at least clarify what these targets mean. But it is basically making sure, or at least a metric to say, okay, we need to make sure that we have enough money in the fund to cover these things. And if we don't, it is a bit more of a red flag as we get closer to the targets, or these, at least the target thresholds. That's like an orange flag, I guess, to really start to pay more attention to those numbers.
So are we seeing, as we approach that 100,000 person milestone, are we seeing the claims payouts become larger over time, or they've seen the average claim per person seems to be holding steady?
The amount is going up because the cap went up, and minimum wage went up. So we do see an increase, both because the number of claims are going up, and because the minimum wage increases, that has a rippling effect on the rest of the benefit calculations.
Should also have an increase in our income too, right? Because we're getting a higher percentage of the wage.
Right, although because the contributions are not as directly tied to the minimum wage. I think that we do see an impact, but it gets a little bit blunted compared to the sort of direct impact we see when we're talking about calculations that are specifically defined by the minimum wage.
I think that's all I have for now, but thank you.
Yeah, I'll point out that, the claims, especially in our projection for this year, is pushing closer to 364 million at this point. Last year, we were, for the full fiscal year, the claims were like close to 300 million. So it's a higher increase, and that not unexpected. I mean, there's outreach efforts and other things going on as well. Incidence typically goes up over time. So we do see some of that, but it is a much higher claims number than what we saw last year over a full fiscal year period. If I remember correctly, the number was 297. I'll try to find it in a second. That's helpful.
It's interesting how fast things add up. If you just do raw math, 100,000 people into that 364 million is $3,600 a piece on average.
Yeah.
I agree with that dog. All right, any other questions? Mike, you muted or you're just shaking your head no.
No questions here.
Okay. All right, thank you, Harinda.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the contribution rate discussion. And Erin, you're up.
Right. So just to level set a little bit, we anticipate having contribution rate discussion be an agenda item for the next few months. We're not going to get it all done today. So I am going to just kind of try and put a 20 minutes or so kind of clock on this part of the discussion, just so that we have time to get to the rest of the agenda, but be assured we know we need to continue talking about this. So it's, and of course, if there's a decision to talk for more than 20 minutes, that's fine. I just don't want us to forget the rest of the agenda. So that's part one. Part two, just want to take a little bit of time today to do a little bit of level setting in terms of the factors that we've been thinking about in terms of kind of the risks. So Harindra and Viva have been sharing with us sort of all the good news. And we've had a lot of good news in terms of our contributions coming in. We've got about a 95% compliance rate that we're working to increase in terms of contributions. Claims volume continues to grow. Investments continue to grow much higher than we had anticipated early on. So we have a lot of good news. We don't want to rely on it always being good. We have to plan for some bumps in the road. I do want to share a couple of things. You had asked about what could happen if we reduce the contribution rate. And we had shared a little bit, and we can definitely update from last spring, but we do have an updated one for what would happen if we reduce the contribution to 0.4, which I know has been suggested. Capital. Let me just get to this. Sorry. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Faces. Trying to make your faces go away so that you can see the screen.
Could you make it a little bit bigger,
Yes,
Erin?
absolutely.
There
Better?
you go. That's
Yeah.
better.
Thank you.
All right. So, with all of the same assumptions that we currently have that Herinda just kind of reported out on at the 0.5 level, if we went down to 0.4 and made no other changes, the fund would be insolvent within less than 10 years. There's really no way that we could afford reasonably going down to 0.4%. And if our incident rates increases beyond what we are currently anticipating, so if our claims volume increases faster than we anticipate, the drop is even more dramatic. So I think this illustrates that we really are talking about very, very narrow margins. The difference between 0.5 and 0.4 is pretty stark. So I just wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to make sure that you are remembering a couple of the things that make us different than other states. Top among those is the fact that our contribution rate is capped at 0.5%. So if we were to reduce it below 0.5% and the solvency started looking concerning, we could never go above the 0.5% to make up for that lost time. That is something that is a constraint on us that other states do not have. Many states don't have a cap at all, or if they have a cap, it's 2 to 3 times higher than ours. So that's something we're very concerned about, because we have looked at other states who have simple mathematical equations for developing their contribution rates. But they have the luxury of going above if they need to increase that contribution rate. So I just wanted to make sure everyone is mindful of our limited tools as we think through what options are available to us. Our recommendation is that we be very cautious. If there is a decision to make any changes, that we make very gradual changes, so that we have the ability to react and not, for example, drop to a whole 100 basis points, because we know that that's very bad for our long-term health. Dave, would you mind sharing your screen and showing some scenarios? One of the things that we are very mindful of, as I mentioned, is that we can't be assured that the numbers will always go up, up, up. We do not want to share in the irrational exuberance that marked the economy before the last recession. So we have to be thoughtful about things that could go wrong and making sure that we have a plan for how we would deal with those things as they go wrong. So Dave, I see that you're starting screen sharing, but I'm not seeing your screen yet.
Yeah, my screen froze, so just give me a second for it to kick in.
All right, if it doesn't work, I'll share mine again. Do you want me to just share mine?
Say again?
Ye-
No.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and share
Okay.
mine. Trying to get to slideshow beginning. All right. Dave, do you want to just quickly talk through the different scenarios that Spring developed for us?
Will do. Okay, thank you, Erin. Okay, so I know that's tough to read, so I'll talk through it. So these were some of the what if scenarios, John, that you had actually referenced to
Mhm.
earlier. And so the first line up on top, which is a dark orange, that's our baseline contributions at 0.5%. And based on our current levels of activity, that's what we're projecting it to be. So in about 10 years, it'd be just over $1 billion. But then we said, what if? And our first scenario was the gray line that you see that's towards the bottom. And that says, what if contributions go down 25% for 2 years, while at the same time, benefit payments go up 50% for 2 years? And as you can see, at the end of that 2 years, there's a decent drop of $584 million. And the fund balance would be about $113 million. Eventually, it starts going up again to about $250 million. But if there's another event in the future, it does put the fund in a more risky position. Another what if scenario
Can I just
was,
clarify for a second? I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're talking about
Sure.
reducing so the 0.5, you're talking about reducing that by 25%, so down to 0.375?
no. We're saying, oh, Erin, do you want to go? I'm sorry.
Sure. I was gonna say, it's not the change in the contribution rate. This is all keeping the contribution rate at 0.5.
Okay.
Right. All these scenarios
Understood,
are,
sorry.
But if the contributions that we receive are reduced, if there was another recession, if there was, high unemployment, things like that, if for some reason the contributions decreased.
okay. Sorry about
Sorry
that,
to
John.
interrupt, sorry. That's okay.
No worries. Fair question. And thank you for helping us clarify. So all these scenarios assume the contribution rate is still at 0.5%. And some of these scenarios were based on history. They're based on the pandemic that happened and the recession about a decade before. And so that's where we got some of the time periods for these. So anyway, the gray line was contributions down 25% 2 years, while benefits were also up 50% for 2 years. The next one I wanted to talk about was the green line. And that shows benefits going up 25% permanently. They're up 25% and they stay at that level. And as you can see, in 10 years, that puts the fund balance in a less than zero position. Stating the obvious, that's not what we want to do. Another scenario we had was the yellow line, which is the second one from the top. And that says, what if the unemployment rate went up 10% and then eventually went back down to 4% over a 7-year period? And so that affects the fund by about $132 million. And then another scenario we had was the blue line, which is the third one from the top. And that said, what if benefits went up by 25%, but then eventually go back to the assumed levels at the baseline over a 6-year period? And again, that was based on things that happened in the past in terms of how long that could historically happen. And that's a $385 million effect to the fund balance. And then our last scenario was, what if the two of those happen at the same time. And that's the brown line you see, that's below the blue line. And that's the sum of the other two lines, but that's a $518 million effect to the fund balance. So in 10 years, you're at $531 million. So that's almost half of the fund balance that gets affected in those scenarios.
But the
So-
only scenario that we go broken is the green one.
Right. So basically we wanted to share with you some of the what ifs that we've been talking about so that we have a framework for saying, all right, even at 0.5%, we can't assume that life is always going to be good, but it may not be horrible unless we have a series of very unfortunate events. So let's think, if we're going to think about reducing the contribution rate, or what are the ways to reduce it that ensure that we don't prevent ourselves from being in a position where we can withstand bad events happening, right? So that's basically kind of the framework we wanted to just share with you. And again, we know that this is going to be a longer term conversation over the next few months, but we just wanted to kind of think about, all right, how do we, right now at 0.5%, we're in a good shape. We can withstand a lot of bad things. What would we need to do if we were to reduce the rate a little bit, how do we make sure that we can still withstand bad events? That's really the task before us over the next few months. Does anyone still need to see this, or can I stop sharing?
You can stop.
Okay, thank you. I can always put it back up again. I just can't see y'all when I'm sharing.
Where did these what if scenarios come from? What generated this? Experience from other entities that are similar to us, or where are the? I guess I'm looking at them when you factor in unemployment. Like you're showing higher unemployment, but also higher claims, which feels like it wouldn't be the case, right? Because if you have less people working and they're not working, they're not eligible for our benefit, I would think, for the most part.
So we did ask Karindra and Viva to look at some historical data. So unemployment rates during the last Great Recession. Actually, they looked at unemployment rates over the last 40 years, and sort of where it went. We also looked at kind of what would happen with another pandemic, where you have wide scale furloughs or layoff situations, but you could still have a bump in claim volume. Our program does allow people who are currently unemployed but had been employed at some point in the 12 weeks before their claim to still file a claim. So we do have something of a tail. So you could have situations where currently unemployed people are still able to file claims. So we can't immediately assume that a reduction in or that an increase in unemployment means a decrease in claims. The other piece is that we also anticipated underemployment. So folks who are working and so still might hit the minimums and still might get maybe not as much money, but they could be working part-time. So I don't know, Parindra or Viva, if you want to add a little more technical explanation to my summary.
I mean, like with the pandemic as an example, we did see unemployment increase and then eventually taper off, but we did see an increase in unemployment, but also, and the data is limited on this, but we did see in some states, at least care for others, the amount of claims increased, and then the data we have on own health is limited, but you could anticipate that in a situation like a pandemic, you have more people needing to take time off for their own health. So that kind of situation, you do have increased unemployment, and increased claims, it tapers off over time back to normal. How long that takes, it depends on what it is and so on. And really how severe it is also depends on the magnet on what it is. But that's a scenario that's possible. The scenario where unemployment is high, but claims were maybe not changing as much, maybe that might be more like what we saw in the 08-09 situation where unemployment increased and then eventually graded down over a number of years. But there was a pretty high unemployment. I think we did see closer to 10% plus in a few of those months right during the recession. So again, a scenario that's possible. The claims being higher, like I said, like we were close to 300 million last year. Now it's close to 360 million. That's higher than expected, and that's potentially possible to be higher, even to be even higher. So some of these are based on looking at the unemployment data is data we have at least going back to something like 1948. So we have quite a bit of data on that. So we do see that there have been months where unemployment's been 10% plus. Let's say not a lot of months, but certainly not inconceivable, if that makes sense. So adding some context to some of those.
Can I make a few comments?
Sure.
So, been thinking about this since our last discussion. And I guess I've kind of thought about it in three different, with three variables. One was we had discussed the wisdom of changing the percentage contribution or the potential of changing it every year and going up and down, and that this might be a challenge to employers. That one doesn't bother me anymore because I've done a little research, talked to some people. People change their payroll every year, their health insurance contributions, dental insurance contributions. In other states with these programs, they do change or have the potential at least to change their rates every year. So that administrative argument to me, I don't support. That's number one. Number two, as we said in the last meeting when we discussed this, in the event of a catastrophe, we have a catastrophic remedy, which is to reduce benefits, okay? Now, no one wants to do that, but no one wants to have a catastrophe either, all right? So that piece is covered, maybe not covered in the best way, but it's covered. So that leaves the third piece, which is to find some objective measure of determining what we should have in our fund. And a couple other states, as Aaron mentioned, have, they do an annual calculation. If our claims this year, just to give, were 100 million, okay, we want to have in our fund 30%, 130% of that. We want to have 130 million. So that we have the same amount that we paid this year, plus we have a cushion. And at least as I'm looking at it, and I would love to hear why I might be looking at it wrong. To me, the only question is how much of a cushion should we keep from year to year? And if you wanted to be conservative, you would keep a larger cushion, 150% of last year's claims, 160%, whatever that number is. If you wanted to be less conservative, you go with 130% or some lower number. So that's kind of where my thinking is on the direction we should go. And if there's something wrong with that approach, keeping in mind we have the catastrophic result, I'd like to hear about it so that I could think about it.
I will say, I think you're absolutely right. Mike, and part of the reason for sharing those scenarios was to help for the future discussion about defining that cushion. So what does that cushion look like? And some of those middle scenarios may help us define that. But you know, I've talked a lot, so I want to make sure, John, Ellen, you have a chance to weigh in as well.
Ellen, I've monopolized some time, so do you have anything you want to share?
No, I mean, I think about it similarly to Mike in the sense that I'm just not sure where that cushion mark is or what's reasonable. You know, it's helpful, I think, Aaron, to see the visuals, to see that in only one of those scenarios, to John's point, were we, you know, at zero, because I do think that indicates to me that there's some way that we could move on the contribution rate that doesn't bring the program to great harm or great risk. And I agree with you too as well, Mike. I mean, employers change their rates for things all the time. Their unemployment rate changes year over year. They do get notice of that in advance. So I think it's good that we're having these conversations now, because they do have to plan for that in some ways. But you know, I think that's kind of where I'm at with the conversation, is just wanting to have a better understanding of what that cushion amount should be. I'd love to know, Aaron, and I don't know if you know this, what that looks like for other states, and how much, you know, they're kind of keeping in their accounts, you know, to
Yeah, we
um
we can share that. We can pull that together and share that. It is tricky because they do have
more
that ability to
flexibility. Yeah.
increase, and some of them have said, you know, it's the sometimes it can get a little bumpy, right? Because you don't really want to be flirting with disaster just because the formula tells you to. So, but we can absolutely pull together what the different states have, recognizing that some states have already changed their calculations a few times.
Have they, just anecdotally, do you know of other state programs that have reduced and then had to go back up because of higher instances and claims being paid out, or
Yeah, I have to find it. We had shared, I think it's this.
Aaron,
know we had
I can
shared
look
it.
for a copy of that if you'd like.
I just found it, but thank you. 'Cause we had shared this last fall. Gotta make sure I found the right one. Okay, make that bigger. Can you
You can move
see?
it up a little bit,
This is
yeah.
from last fall.
okay. Oh, I see. Okay.
And so we know, for example, Washington State had started pretty low and have been going up since, and had to get a $200 million infusion of funds from their legislature. Also, some of that, the pandemic makes everything difficult, right?
Yeah, of
And
course.
they were live right in the beginning of the pandemic, but they started low and had to go up. Which one is the Rhode Island is sort of hovers, right? They don't go too high, they don't go too low. They just kind of hover around the 1.2%. They went up to 1.3, we had to go back down to 1.1. So, and then the folks who started really low had to jump. So, although we learned New Jersey had their TDI, so their disability side of the coin, for a very long time, like for decades. Then they had expanded to the family side. Didn't do any work to really notify anybody that it existed for several years. There was a change in administration, and so kind of talk about the fact that their law changed, but their program really didn't get off the ground right away.
Mm.
That may also be why they kind of stayed the same for a while and then had to ramp up. Now they're able to come back down again. So there's definite, no one's solved the problem. I'll tell you that. No one has a silver bullet.
Are we the only state though that started off by by creating a savings account before we paid claims?
No, everybody did. Only state that is not planning on doing that is Minnesota, which has not gone live yet. But they had essentially enough surplus in their state budget that the state basically pre-funded the year. So it gave them enough money to be the equivalent of a year. But everybody else, whether it's a year, whether it's slightly more than a year, I think, I don't remember if it's Oregon or Colorado, one of them had to go live with a little bit less than a year. Massachusetts did a bifurcated approach, so they went live with own serious health condition and pregnancy only for 6 months and then added everything else in. So they actually got more than a year of contributions. It's pretty standard.
You know,
So
I have a question. You know, I've been thinking, since we have somebody from the Department of Labor, our unemployment rate does change from year to year, and that's based on the experience the state is having with unemployment claims. Is there any correlation from that department as far as income versus claims that we can take away into how we're operating our own program?
I mean, I can certainly ask. I'm not on the unemployment side, so I don't know, you know, exactly. But I mean, I think that one of the things that, I mean, it certainly changes year over year based on the experience of employers with the program. So that's true of any employer. And it doesn't necessarily mean experience of the program overall, but me as an employer, if I have higher instances of unemployment from being claimed against my account from my employees or former employees, my rate is going to go up. So it's not across the board in the same way that we're across the board at a consistent rate for folks. And it is reassessed at the end of every year. And then the rate that they determine in December for folks continues on, you know, through the next year. So it fluctuates in that way. So, you know, it seems a little bit more to me that there's volatility, I think, more consistently than what we're talking about in terms of the catastrophic like events. I mean, certainly that impacts on the unemployment side too, but it's volatile just from employer to employer.
So I do want to make sure everyone is aware that it's currently 9:53, and even though we won't be able to do the
I have one more thing, and we can.
Yeah, no, I
move
just
on.
want to.
Yeah.
We have time because we won't be able to do the RFP discussion, but I just want to make sure I'm cognizant of the time for everyone.
And I think this is just a quick ask. You know, in the actuarial reports that Harindra is putting together, can we ask them to put in some what if scenarios if the contribution rate was 0.475 and 0.45, how that would impact the overall finances of the organization for one, like, and do it as a 1 year, like we decide next year to do it for 0.475 or 0.45, just to see what those numbers would look like.
Sure. So absolutely. So what I'm hearing is that for the next meeting, it would be helpful. I think we're all really focusing on defining what the right cushion is, to use Mike's word. And we can look at other states' calculations, like what factors they're using, and we can look at what would happen at 0.475 and 0.45, and like what would happen if it was like just for 1 year, and then kind of moving on from there. And is there any other kind of, are there any other things that you would like us to prepare for the next meeting? And if you think of things after, you can always write to us, or call, email, text, whatever you want to do.
Any other comments on this discussion?
No.
Contribution?
I have one question though, if we have time for one more question.
Of course.
So in discussing the kind of known unknowns, there was reference to unemployment and a recession. And I understand if there's a recession that employees would be laid off, you can anticipate that, and contributions would be decreased. But it sounded like, are we assuming that if there's a recession or high unemployment, that our claims would go up as well?
So that's part of some of the assumptions that we had asked for. We recognize that there's a slight tail because it's that 12-week, you have to be employed in the 12 weeks. And then after that, eligibility, the number of folks who are eligible would probably go down. But I think it is reasonable for us to anticipate that there could be a higher rate of claims, either if the reason for the change in unemployment is due to another pandemic or another medical event where you could see more claims, or just based on I don't know, 20 years of employment law. When you see uncertainty in the workplace, risks of layoffs or other things, you do see an increase in number of workers' comp claims and number of FMLA leaves. Also, a number of discrimination claims go up too in times of uncertainty around the workplace. So kind of taking that into consideration as well.
It sounds like some amount of increase, but it's difficult to measure, maybe impossible to measure.
Well, right. And so that's where, this is definitely an art and not a science. And so which goes into kind of what is being careful, being systematic. And I think we have, and we will continue the conversation for this will definitely stay on the agenda.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, I think we've tackled this one for now. Unless there's anything else, I'll go ahead and move ahead to our budget review. And Dave, you're up.
Okay, I'm going to try sharing again, and hopefully it'll work this time.
Yay.
It worked? Okay.
It works.
Fantastic. All right, so we're going to go over the results for January for the authority. So for the month of January, for our operating accounts, we had net activity of almost $4.0 million. We did have $5 million transferred from the contribution fund this month. So that's why it's larger than usual, or larger than you might remember. Fund recovery penalties are still coming in more than we have budgeted for. So that's also a positive variance. In terms of expenses, we had over $976,000 of expenses. That was $721,000 better than budget. That is larger than better. Certainly that's a positive number, and we're happy about that. A lot of that was due to a timing difference because we had budgeted some significant software licenses to happen in January that actually happened earlier in the year. We paid for them so we could be on the same time schedule as the state and also utilize the buying power of the state as well. So that was a win for us. And if you look at the software license number, that had been a negative variance for a while, and now it's almost even Steven. So that straightened out as we said it would. But as far as what the significant expenses were for the month of January, it was the usual. Payroll and related benefits were $612,000. The contact center was $128,000. IT consultants were $86,000. Our outreach efforts were $81,000. Year to date, our income less expenses is 2.9. You do see a negative 2.2 variance, but again, just as a reminder, We didn't transfer $5 million in the first quarter because we had enough money in operating reserves. So that's why that's negative, but you'll see the offset in the contribution account will show later. As far as expenses though, we are $2.2 million ahead of budget so far for the year. Moving on to, there we go. Moving on to bond activity. Bond activity was light this month. We had $28,000 for continued improvements to our fund recovery system. We had budgeted some other enhancements that we were going to do. Those haven't started yet, in part because the bond proceeds that we had budgeted, we didn't get. But we are looking at utilizing other funds such as in operations to go forward on some of those things. So stay tuned for more updates on that in the future. As far as bond money, we do still have bond money of $2.4 million. So we are intending to use that as well for future items that would require bond funds. So we'll continue to use that money up that we still have remaining that has been allocated to us thus far. In terms of contribution activity, contributions came in for the month, I'm sorry, for the quarter, and so most of them came in during the month of January, and that's why we got $98.3 million. That was just under what we had budgeted, relatively speaking, by $146,000. We did get some fund recovery money in there that was better than budget, and also some investment income that continues to be at about 5.4%. So that was higher than the rate at what we had budgeted, and that's why there's a positive variance. Benefit activity for the month was $27.2 million. That equates to about an average of $6.8 million a week for benefits paid. That's a little lower than it was in the past, but what we've seen now for a couple of years in a row is some seasonality in benefits paid. Starting around early December, right after Thanksgiving and during the holidays, there's less claims that come in that time, and then they start picking up again in about mid-January through February. And so you'll see an increased activity in February. In fact, about a week or two ago, we set another record for benefits paid, over $7.5 million in a week. So we are seeing that uptick again, as we did in the prior year. But overall, for the month, we were $7.8 million ahead of budget. And year to date, we are $26.7 million ahead of budget, a positive variance on all the lines. The contribution fund itself has over $596 million in the fund, available for benefit payments and administrative expenses. And again, total assets are over almost $618 million. And again, most of those are sitting in the short-term investment fund, about $579 million. And again, that's earning about a rate of 5.4%. We do think the fund will earn that rate at least through the next few months of the year. After that, it's really anybody's guess. We're not sure if it's going to go up or it's going to go down. Depends A, on the economy, and B, the Fed's reaction to the economy and what they do with rates. But as far as for the end of this fiscal year, we do expect expenses to come in at about $14.3 million. That's $3 million ahead of budget, and that's driven by the same reasons it's been driven by the past few months. Filling positions at the authority is happening later than we budgeted. So there's savings in both payroll and medical benefits and pension benefits, and the I drew a mental blank for a second. A grievance adjudication, the money we spend on appeals. The appeals volume has been less than what we budgeted for, and so the money paid for grievance adjudication has been less than what we budgeted for. So we expect that to be lower than budgeted, and that's another major driver for the fiscal year. And finally, as far as the contribution fund is concerned, we expect the net activity to be about $74.5 million. That's about $61.7 million better than budget. That number did go up by about $4 or $5 million compared to last time. Again, as we said earlier, one of the main drivers of that was increased investment income. Again, we had budgeted conservatively, and the rate has gone up to more than what we expected. So we've increased our projection for it to be at that rate more or less for the rest of the year. So that's where we expect to be at the end of the year, and that's where we are for January. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
No. Thank
Okay.
you, Dave. It sounds like there's no questions.
Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda is old business. Is there any old business? Hearing none. How about new business?
No?
Hearing none. The next session was our executive session, but we can't do that. So I guess we'll move on to adjournment. Is that the correct format? All right. So is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
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 We are adjourned at 10:07.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
You.